Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation today. Just very briefly, as many of you probably know, the Committee on Climate Change is an independent public body that was set up under the Climate Change Act in order to advise the government and Parliament on how we are going to meet the duty that is set up in the Act to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in the UK by 80% relative to 1990 levels by the year 2050. And the Committee on Climate Change spends a lot of its time trying to understand what the most cost-effective way of doing that is in steady, discrete steps between 2008, when the committee was set up, through to 2050, when we have to reach that 80% target. Carbon capture and storage has for a long time been one of the most important technologies to try to meet that cost-effective path through to 2050. And in fact, in lots of the conversations that I have, the focus of them in terms of carbon capture and storage is around the power sector and what can carbon capture and storage do to remove greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector. And in fact, our analysis and lots of other analysis demonstrates that really the most important role for carbon capture and storage in terms of that cost-effective removal of greenhouse gases is for it to play a role in industry, and is for it to allow industry, as we saw in the video and as we've been hearing, to continue to produce both in the UK but indeed around the world whilst reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. And initiatives such as this one that try to understand the costs at which we can realistically deliver carbon capture and storage are very important in that context. Yesterday, the committee laid before Parliament its annual progress report, and the progress report sets out for the UK where we are against that cost-effective trajectory to 2050 and the 80% reduction in greenhouse gases. And as part of that report, we set out the facts and figures for Parliament and for the government to consider about where we stand against the ambition. One of the notable things about the year that's just gone by is that 2014 saw a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the UK on the order of 8%. So in 1 year, we reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 8%, by far the largest amount in any single year, with the exception potentially of the very first year of the financial crisis. And it's notable not just because it was a large reduction in greenhouse gases, but also that reduction came against the backdrop of GDP growth at about 2.8% and manufacturing growth at about 3%. And that's precisely the type of outcome that we're aiming for, where we can continue reducing our emissions year on year, whilst also growing the economy and growing manufacturing. The other point that comes through the analysis that we presented to Parliament yesterday is the central question of whether that trajectory of a reduction in greenhouse gases is likely to continue without further government action, further industrial action, further action on the part of households and businesses. And the answer to that from the analysis is no, is that we can't count on a continuing reduction in greenhouse gases if this Parliament and if all of us collectively aren't acting over the next 5 years, because a number of policies and a number of projects that have produced the reduction to date come to an end during the course of the next few years. And if we don't have new projects and new innovation and new R&D and new government action coming through the 2020s, then we won't continue to reduce our emissions in line with that cost-effective path to 2050. And again, that's why projects such as this one, new ideas and new projects and new ways of delivering that innovation are so important, and they continue to come forward through the course of the 2020s. The 15 million tons that was mentioned before, by the time we get to 2030, could remove 3 or 4% of our greenhouse gas emissions in that one area, in that one project, for which we would be a very important contribution at that point in time then to reducing greenhouse gases down to the levels that are commensurate with global action and with UK action to meet the risks and the threats from climate change. And so one of the points that we put forward, and one of the reasons I'm happy to be here today, one of the recommendations that we make to government in the report that Parliament now has, is that there is increased emphasis on joining up the programs around CCS between the power sector and the industrial sector, and that we push forward with making sure that the infrastructure that's being created, that the storage that's being created is joined up, and that we can cost effectively deliver carbon capture and storage by making sure that as many projects as possible hook into that infrastructure and use it cost effectively. Government has a statutory, a legal duty to respond to the report by mid-October, and I'm sure they'll be looking for good and interesting projects and ways of being able to respond in a positive way that says, look, there are these ideas out here, and this is a sensible way of trying to back innovative projects that are trying to demonstrate the potential to deliver at least cost. So with all of that, I'm very glad to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Matthew.